Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the 17th episode of the Constitution and American Life with the Friends of Publius. This is our last episode before America decides on who their 47th President of the United States will be, and suffice it to say that, like most others, most of the fops will be sitting on pins and needles in anticipation of the outcome. This excludes, of course, Professor Moore, who instead will be canvassing the historical record to determine who won the election of 1824. Before we get to our topic of discussion, let's take a moment to address our question of the day, provided to teachers for class discussion and to students for discussion wherever and with whomever they wish. So our question of the day for this episode is, to what extent, if any, does the U.S. government have a responsibility to apologize and compensate those groups who, in our history, were deprived of their natural rights by the government over a long period of time? Does our government need to apologize and compensate those groups? Enjoy that conversation, and hopefully we'll get some feedback from you. Talking about times in history, let's get to our this day in history for our scholars here to provide some insight and some perspective. So on this day in history in 1534, this is a strong suit of Professor Williams, all right? He's a 16th century specialist here. So in 1534, on this day, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, making Henry VIII and all other subsequent monarchs the head of the Church of England. Minor, mid-major, or major moment in history, Professor Kavanaugh?
Oh God, I think that was like
That's what Henry said.
I think that was like eighth grade year. Let me think. I'm trying to remember. Uh, I think it's major. I mean, I really do think it's major because I think it finalizes the split. That began with that boy, old Martin Luther nailing some stuff on some church door somewhere in Germany, right? So he starts, some worried about these papal indulgences and these kinds of things, and that I think that's the final hammer of the nail in the split of the church. And we know that let the wars commence. I mean, my goodness, you still have peace walls in Dublin, right? Peace walls to separate the Catholics from the Protestants, and they put them up really high in these neighborhoods in Belfast so people wouldn't throw petrol bombs over the top of them. All thanks to the split in the church. So I'm going to go major.
Professor Williams?
Yeah, I'm going to go major as well. A little different reason. Why are you laughing at me, Dave? A little different reason. The coming together of sort of secular and religious power. That's what one of the things this act did, and I think it set into motion a process where, 300 years later or so, 250 years later, there's going to be an argument that what makes for the most best form of limited government would be to have a country where those forms of power are not consolidated. So I think it's major.
Professor Moore?
I'm going to go minor and maybe moderate on a good day. Largely because this trend was started long before Henry. I mean, the blending of church and state through a powerful head. I mean, you've got Constantine, the original. Although, I mean, this goes back into the ancient world. Ancient kings were made the head of their religion. So I think it's in a long train of a long tradition of strong figureheads being put at the head of a religious entity. So I mean, Charlemagne is another one there. So I'd say I mean, I think Chris's point's well taken that it unleashes a lot of I would say a new round of trying to sort out the meaning of this blending. But I see it kind of going back into the ancient world, and Henry is kind of a new chapter in a long tradition of that.
Well, I give it a mid-major because without this, we would not have had Herman Hermits, Henry VIII, I am, great song from the 1960s. So, that's how past and
And
present
that
connect to
the
each other.
second verse, is that same as the first?
Same as the first.
Okay.
Hey, it was great lyrics for its time. Great lyrics for its time. All right.
It was clever.
It was okay. So, as stated earlier, our discussion topic today emanates from Unit 6, Question 2 of the We the People State questions, and asks students to address how the founders' decisions on slavery shaped contemporary debates over states' power and federal authority. So, let's begin our discussion with our resident 18th century expert, Professor Tim Moore. Kim, to what degree was there resistance to the slavery provisions agreed to in Philadelphia? And I have a second follow-up to that, but we'll start with there. Was there dissent, or
Yeah.
is it just overwhelmingly this is what we're doing and not much debate?
Well, I think resistance, I would like to parse out a little, maybe different kinds of resistance. I mean, I think for us today, a lot of our thinking about the provisions and the resistance is centered on the idea of this moral principle: was slavery right or wrong? Um, and unfortunately, in the convention, there wasn't a whole lot of moral quandary about slavery. I mean, there's a famous now, there was resistance to the clauses, but a lot of it was just straight up political and transactional resistance. Well, we don't like, we want 0/5 rather than 5/5 represent. So a lot of the resistance was political. It had very little to do with morality, and that's what makes the this very well-founded idea that slavery, there was a witch at the christening, the bargains that they made were morally reprehensible. Um, but of the three, on a moral level, the 1808, the importation clause did cause the most moral discussion. There was a little bit within the 3/5. There was not much about the fugitive slave clause, not a whole lot of moral content in those discussions, but it centered on the 180, what would be known as the 1808 clause. I mean, very early, Pinckney from South Carolina, Rutledge, I think the Rutledge late July says he chastises everybody at the mere mention of there's a moral component to this whole discussion we're having. And I think the quote is, I'm paraphrasing, let's keep morals. This has nothing to do with morals. I mean, if you really want a cringeworthy moment in the convention, I think Rutledge's comment about that would would merit your attention. But in the 1808 clause, you had the Massachusetts folks of King, calling it iniquitous. So there occasionally, and Sherman as well. Mason and Morris, Governor Morris, give really remarkable. In fact, I think Mason's speech is probably the most eloquent. I call it like his degrading speech, where he mentions like slavery, how it degrades an entire people, not just the slave, the enslaved person, but also the enslaver. It's morally degrading. It's economically degrading. It's a really wonderful thing to look at if you want to see a rare moment when morality factors into the discussions at the convention. It's I think 22 August. I have here that Mason's degrading speech.
So, in preparing, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I want to throw in Madison too, because even Madison says in the
Yeah.
debates, they're debating something else, and the language that they're going to use. I mean, it's in a way, in this topic, the document is very politically correct, but Madison says it's a mistake to admit in the Constitution that there's property in men.
Yeah.
So that's a frustrating thing to understand, that there is the realization of that. Also, For the 1808 clause, Madison, I think, says 20 years is enough time for, for enough
Enough mischief.
mischief,
Yeah.
enough mischief. And he also says, too, looking into his crystal ball, we talk about these debates and we talk about the great compromise and the House and the Senate. And Madison says the debate won't be between the big and the small states. It'll be between the states with slaves and the states without slaves. So it's almost like he's looking into his crystal ball and foreseeing, 1860 rolling around, or 1850s, and the debate heating up over slavery. So I think this to put out there, they understood. I think somebody called it a coiled up snake under the table, waiting.
So in preparation for this, I went through a box of material I have, and I found a source that I had received over 3 decades ago. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with Professor Gary Nash at UCLA on the national standards for history and civics, and the source, and it's obviously I would call it a progressive historical viewpoint, but it argues that slavery was the driving issue, cementing the power of the states in our federal republic. Would you agree with that, Professor Moore? That that's the key component in making sure states retained a tremendous amount of power in our federal system?
No, I think you have to ignore some other issues from other states that they're protective of their sovereignty. Now, it might be, I don't know if you put it on the significant meter. I think I'm not denying that it is uh, a major issue on the state sovereignty, state powers issue. But I think there's some commercial interests that are not related to slavery that also would factor into that would make some states protective of their authority.
Chris or Mike, any
I would, I'm not familiar with that, but I would argue, or I guess I would say that your statement, David, would be directly related to the Three-Fifths Compromise. And that whole concept of states maintaining that power is solely based on that compromise of counting 5 enslaved people with 3 white people for the purposes of representation. I think that would be one of the driving forces. But again, and I've said this before, if you look at the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we're free and independent states. And as free and independent states, what can we do? We can levy war, we can conclude peaces, contract alliances, everything that free and independent states can do. So when you're moving from this decentralized government into this central government, is slavery an issue? Yes. Is it the driving issue for state power? I don't know if it's the central issue.
The argument is the starting point. I mean, again, I think that's a starting point to go from that. The starting point of this source was Madison's Virginia plan and the centralization, and again, the great diminishment in that plan of state power and the role of the state. And the resistance, according to this source, really is coming from slave states. And it's not just the Three-Fifths Clause, it's also the Senate, the Electoral College. Those kind of agreements are also pushed by these slave states for fear, all right, of population, differences, which obviously the Three-Fifths, that's partly, if I understood.
I think that's really ham-handed. I mean, you look at New York and their resistance through the 1780s to centralized power, and it had little to do, if at all, with slavery. I mean, it was just straight up commerce.
Well, isn't slavery commerce?
Well, it is, but my point is, within certain states' context, it's not an issue. So I think, and I like Gary Nash's work. He's a wonderful writer.
And I don't think it's his source. It's a source he provided me as we were discussing some stuff. Yeah. I'll have to, to look at it more closely. But, well, again, you say commerce, but am I not accurate here that although northern, if we want to call them that, northern states aren't participating in the owning of slaves, all right, they are participating in commerce. And
Right.
protecting that commercial industry is important to them as well. And the power of, especially like a state of New York, all right, which is going to be a great port of entry in many ways for a lot of commerce there. That's what I'm just wondering is.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't think you have much of a case when it comes to New Hampshire or Vermont. I just I just at first blush it just seems to me a little ham-handed to make that statement.
So
I
it's a
think
role, but it's not the most
Oh,
significant.
sure, a
Okay.
roll, definitely. Yeah.
I think it's interesting if we were to fast forward into the 1850s and say you take a Frederick Douglass and a William Lloyd Garrison and their competing views on the Constitution. You know,
Yeah.
Douglass sees it as a pro-liberty document, where obviously William Lloyd Garrison, or no, what am I getting? Am I getting his name right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And he's saying, this is a
It's a
compact.
covenant with the devil.
Yeah, yeah, a covenant with the devil. So, this is, and he's burning copies of the Constitution publicly because of that. So you had two guys who were leading abolitionists of their day and taking different viewpoints of the Constitution. So,
Yeah,
and I
but
mean,
that's right. But Douglas eventually came around to Garrison's point of view, right?
well, no, he was kind of a Garrisonian originally, and then
Yeah.
he kind of splits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Once he kind of gets,
Well known
noticed.
and influential.
Yeah, he kind of splits from Garrison. He's not, honestly, I'm not sure that he's as radical as Garrison.
Yeah, no, I had that backwards then. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I would lean a little more into the importance of it. I don't think it's the factor, but I think that I mean, and Tim, correct me on this. I think slavery was the issue that the South was willing to walk away from the convention
Oh,
over.
sure. And
So,
that comes up at the convention. You do anything touching slavery, we're walking. Now,
so
was that a real threat or not? That's the great debate, on that.
but
Yeah.
then everything that, I mean, as David pointed out, it's just not what's the Three-Fifths Clause. The other thing, I mean, we know the consequences of what happens with the Senate and the Electoral College. We know how that shapes the first 30, 40 years of American history, right?
Yeah.
In terms of who has political power. Now, I know these folks couldn't look into a crystal ball and know exactly, but I think they believe they'd struck a pretty good bargain, or at least the bargain that they knew that they could sell back in their home state.
They could
So
get it ratified. They could get it ratified.
Yeah. Yep.
So, Chris, again, the question that students have to deal with and teachers have to help them deal with is, in my mind, kind of all over the place. Takes a lot of different pathways here. So, I apologize if I do so as well. But in preparing for this, the 10th Amendment jumped out at me, and that's because where I live, the 10th Amendment is forefront in the argument of conservatives for power, where power is located and how power is protected in our federal system. So do you agree that the 10th Amendment is a key barrier to federal overreach and a key protector of state powers in our system?
It has been. It has been, but remember, the 10th Amendment was not part of the original Constitution. It's going to be, put in by Madison and approved by Congress and ratified by the states when it goes out. And it is provided a floor, right? I think the 10th Amendment has provided a floor and has given states a basis from which to argue and challenge federal overreach. So
can I ask you this? Isn't it redundant? Isn't the 10th Amendment just redundant? I mean, isn't that what the court said in Darby versus US? Said they're just restating a truism? That the language of Article 9, 8, 9, and 10 already do this, and the 10th is just, it's just saying what we already know.
Well, Darby's way down the line. I mean, at the time, I think the 10th Amendment is a big deal. In fact, they're angry that Madison doesn't put the word expressly.
Expressly, I mean, that becomes a big issue.
So it's a big deal at its creation, because it's state, and in a way, you're right, David. It might even be a truism at that point, because states precede the nation. States precede the nation, and I think, I'm suspicious of state power, as well, because I think Madison's right. The states at our founding were the source of all kinds of mischief too. So I'm not making an argument for state sovereignty here, but there you can't ignore states precede the nation. That's a powerful set of
Well,
inertia,
unless you're
and
Abraham
I think
Lincoln.
the 10th Amendment is attempting to restate that truism.
Yeah, but Lincoln is believed that the nation existed before the states. So, I mean, uh, throw that out there. But I think partly too is like I think if you go back and as students, if you really want to get knee deep in the weeds in this, go back and look at Madison's original list that he gives to Congress to approve, because
Yeah.
what comes out of Congress is not what Madison originally says. Because one of the things that Madison wants as well, in addition to the 10th Amendment, is he wants a national veto over state laws. That doesn't come out of that doesn't make it out of Congress, shockingly. But I want to go back to the idea that it does in writing provide a floor. Is it redundant? Maybe. But now we have it as part of higher law. It's part of our Constitution. It's not a statute. It is an amendment to the Constitution. And now we know that there are certain things that the states, their powers are reserved to the states. And I want to go back to Tim's point about the word expressly, which go back to Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18, the necessary and proper clause. They wish for some better language in there as well. So, Mike, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was just wanting to ask Tim, when you say the states preceded the nation, I understand what you're saying. What would you say if I countered and said, well, the colonies preceded the nation, but maybe the nation and the states maybe were created a lot closer together in time than the states preceded the nation rather than colonies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's a fair point. And you might be right, but I guess I would counter. I know you well enough to know that you well, here's the question. Do people does a people exist before their legal code? Or does the legal code create the people? And I think when it comes to American colony era, and I think Lutz kind of makes this point with his argument, from charters to covenants to constitutions, that maybe peoples, self-identified peoples, precede their legal system. And so I think that also might play into this notion that a people precedes the nation too. And we still wrestle with the fact, are we indeed a nation, a single people? We're still wrestling with that. So, and I don't know there's a clean answer here, but I'm just saying there's a problem there that we got to wrestle with to some degree.
Well, and I would agree with you that if they had used the word expressly, then the 10th Amendment has a heck of a lot more significance. But the reality is they didn't. And as Chris mentions, and I'm looking at this obviously through the lens of contemporary constitutional discussion. And this argument I know that bugs you, Tim, but that's the world I live in. And what bugs me is, well, they can't do that. And you go, well, show me in the Constitution where they can't do that. Because the limits on federal power found in Article 1 are not that broad. They're not that numerous, because Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 also throws a nice little curveball on those powers not delegated. Well, which powers? Is it just the ones that are enumerated in Article 9 and 10 between the federal and state, or are there more there? So, that's partly where I'm looking at this.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Barron v. Baltimore in here as well. I'm not sure where it fits into this discussion, but there's a little light flashing in the back of my skull cabinet back here saying, well, Barron v. Baltimore, the Bill of Rights does not apply to the states, right? So the whole idea of this Bill of Rights, the national government, states continue to do your own thing. And I don't know where it fits into this discussion, but the idea of Chief Justice Marshall, saying, well, the Bill of Rights does not protect you from the state governments. So that's kind of
it does fit. I think that's a good point there, Chris. So, Professor Williams, from Dred Scott to Brown v. Board to Shelby Counter versus Holder, over time, has the court, in your opinion, been able to create a good balance between liberty, individual rights, and the common good? Yeah, okay, I know. But what's your read of that because that seems to me kind of what the question is asking the students to do is look at the evolutionary nature of our society and how well has the court played this institution as trying to balance and I think part of that is how well has the court addressed the glaring injustices of our history there, which seems to be the implication partly of this question. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a good follow-up based on what the question they gave us to deal with, right? So let me give a shot at this, and I'm anxious to hear what Chris and Tim and you have to say. I would say the simple answer is no. I don't think that there's been a good balance. I would argue that, I mean, I know you're framing this question because you're responding to the question and that we've been given, but Supreme Court justice, I just don't believe they're just these impartial sort of umpires, right? So this idea of them balancing is kind of like calling balls and strikes, and I don't believe that. I think Supreme Court justices and the court is influenced by the political time and culture that they're in. So y'all have heard me talk about this a lot. There's a argument by this guy, Roger Smith, a political scientist out of, I believe it's Princeton or Yale. I'm kind of forgetting now. Sorry, Professor Smith. He argues that the three sort of threads in American political history aren't just protection of liberty and common good, but he calls it ascriptive tendencies or nativistic tendencies that are in our sort of political culture as well. All that's to say, I think that we can see that the court as an institution making these judgment calls more often than not, I think, hasn't sided with marginalized groups as much as it has sided with either state power or majority groups. And I think you mentioned Dred Scott, which is the decision to focus on before the Civil War. But after we get the Civil War amendments, and I look at how the 14th Amendment was interpreted during the 19th and 20th centuries, and all the decisions in the 19th century were not ones that were supportive of former slaves. We can go through slaughterhouse cases, civil rights case, Cruikshank. We can go through all those. You get Brown, and you get the cases after Brown, but in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been I don't know, a pendulum swing where you have Shelby, you have the affirmative action cases. So it seems to me that there hasn't been a balance struck. I think that in most cases, and we could look at the 13th Amendment as well, and how the court has narrowly interpreted what involuntary servitude means and what badges of slavery means. So my assessment is that over time, it has not struck a good balance. It's probably been more likely to give deference to states and state autonomy and the majorities in states than to the individual rights of marginalized groups.
Chris or Tim?
I agree with what Mike just said. I kept thinking, and Tim, you're going to have to help me with the author, Hollow Hope. Who's the author?
Rosenberg, Gerald Rosenberg.
A great book called The Hollow Hope that we probably alluded to before. Actually, Tim turned me on to the book, and the idea, that do we rely on the courts in these cases that you brought up, David, and if we rely on the courts to make these what we would say would be opinions, right, come up with judgments that would actually favor humanity. I don't know a better way to describe that when I'm thinking of some of these cases. He describes it as a hollow hope that the court is it responding to society or does it shape society? And he's basically, I think, saying don't rely on the courts to fix this stuff.
Yeah, it would have been so, if I could go back, I'd have bought into Hamilton's argument to obliterate the states, make them administrative units, from the very beginning. Because I mean, what we're trying to balance, I mean, balancing in and of itself, without our the race, as Du Bois called it, the question of America. We're trying to balance an issue, race, within the context of the states. We have these states, and so just by nature, we're trying to balance one thing on the one side that has this tradition of being deeply rooted within the tradition of slavery. We're trying to balance that, or in some cases, we're trying to divorce the state federal relationship devoid from the issue of slavery. Well, I don't know that you can separate those out, given our tradition of trying to address race injustices. So balancing in and of itself is tricky without the baggage of race and sexism. But they're so integrally entwined within localized governments in our tradition. So it's very difficult.
And that's
Very
I guess
difficult.
that's the bridge to my question for you. And that's my struggle, I guess, partly
Yeah.
with this question is the students are asked to deal with civil rights and voting rights in more modern history and how they illustrate the tension
Yeah.
between the founders' principles. Well, the founders didn't really have and correct me if I'm wrong, but the founders didn't really have a notion of civil and rights and voting rights within the context of the national government. That is, those things are all going to be left up to the state governments to decide if we're talking about the 18th century founding. Now, if we're talking about the 19th century founding, which I
Right.
don't know if the students are given a choice of which founding the question
Well,
is responding to, but I guess my question to you, Tim, is it seems to me that we've done an adequate job of maintaining the founding principles here by leaving it, for the most part in our history, up to state governments. And as was rightfully said, in the last 20
right.
years or so, the court's gone back to that. Let's let states decide because that's the
Well,
historic and founding principle.
that's a fair discussion, which ultimately might lead to another question. I think you might be headed in this direction about which founding principles do we want to keep, which count founding principles might we want to, or are there different ones or something like that? And this Roosevelt book goes to this issue. So your point's well taken. If they're trying to balance this idea, between states and national government, that is one of the founding dilemmas. So we have to, if we're stuck in that founding period, we're going to constantly try to balance those founding principles, state and national. So your point's well taken that maybe those founding principles let's stop trying to balance them. And that's my point. Maybe Hamilton had some insight there. We wouldn't have had to done all this balancing if we'd have paid attention to making them administrative units. So your point's well taken that the founding of the 18th century may be different than the 14th Amendment founding.
Well, help me out. How do you read the question?
Oh my
Let's
gosh.
help the students out here. Is it the first founding, or are they free
I'm
to choose?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of better living through chemistry, but I think reading this question, I might consider a gummy or two. This is a hard question. That's bad. Oh, gosh.
Do we need to put a disclaimer at the bottom of
You
the
really,
tape?
You went,
this is if we were live together in the same room with each other, I would fully expect one of you to just grab me by the throat and say, "Shut up." Um,
I give you a cracker and cheese and say, no gummies for you.
Yeah. This is a hard question. I mean, you're right, David. This is all over the map. How do I read it? I I honestly, and this might be totally unsatisfactory. I read the question as, "Hey, what do you think of founding principles, kids?" And I mean,
Yeah,
frankly,
yeah.
if I was going to write this question, that's what it would have been. Hey, do you like the founding principles? If you don't, how about, and I'm, having read this Roosevelt book, I would really I would quote the Roosevelt book as maybe being the second founding. And I think that's kind of his argument. Uh, but I look at it as kids. What do you think of the founding principles? Were they all that in the baggage? You know, are some worth keeping, some worth abandoning? I think we kind of got confused with so many specific things to think about in context to the founding. You know, with the federalism and the voting and all of that. But,
That you're right, Tim. That was very unsatisfactory. That's like a photo on a menu where, man,
You
that
sure
looks
you haven't
good.
had a gummy already? Cookie,
Yeah.
maybe? Cookie?
Yeah. Yeah.
no, no, no.
I think
So,
it's I think it's I think it's the founders because it's capital F. I got the questions here, so I'm reading them, and I'm with Tim. This is quite the buckshot shotgun question here.
Yeah.
But I think they're talking about the founding era and not the second founding. Eric Foner's great book, The Second Founding, as well as Roosevelt's book that we've talked about multiple times.
oh, okay. So if we're being historically accurate, all right, and we travel back in time and we say, hey, founder, what do you think about these civil rights issues and voting rights issues? What in the HE double toothpicks are they going to say?
They're going to say, "Excuse me,
Yeah.
how'd you get back here?" Um, they're going to absolutely. They're like, no. Of course, these enslaved people cannot vote, and of course, these women cannot vote. Of course, these poor white people cannot vote. Right? Those are the founding. Those are some of those founding principles.
Yeah.
We're going to let those states decide who gets to vote, but we sure as heck know it's not going to be these people, or those people. So, I mean, those are some founding principles there. So, students, good luck.
So, Chris, getting back to the federalism, because that's again another component of this, has the distribution of power between states and national governments been effective as the nation expanded? That is, they wanted a division of power, some balance there to keep limited government or government limited. From your perspective, has that worked out?
I think, historically speaking, we can go back in time. Actually, we're going to borrow your time machine. But there have been times when it has and times when it hasn't. And obviously, in 1861, it didn't work very well. I mean, it kind of came to a head, and it took a civil war to solve this kind of urinating contest, if you will, between national government and state governments. I think that prior to the Civil War, people referred to the United States are. They used the plural, right? They used a plural verb, and it took the Civil War to change that verb to United States is. So, how well has it worked? Well, I guess it's worked okay because we're still arguing and cussing and discussing about stuff. So, and we've had courts to be able to decide, okay, federal government, you've gone too far, or state governments, you've got to make these changes. You think about the civil rights cases that Mike was just dealing with. So, in a modern sense, that how's it worked? Well, it's
Well,
gone
isn't
back.
there, I
It's
got to
gone back
ask
and
you,
forth.
isn't there a tipping point? And maybe this is a question, for a political scientist here, but isn't there a tipping point? And this is what I used to tell my students is that the larger something becomes, the more populated, the more people we are, mandates more authority, more power to the government because you have, more probability for problems. That is, you look at large schools, all right, large high schools that three of us, taught in the high school level. Large high schools mandate more security, more rules than a small school, in my mind there. And so as the nation grew, it seemed to me logical that the power of the national government would have to grow with it. And that traditional balance between state and national power would have to be disrupted and state power would have to be diminished. That's my read.
Well, I think we see that too. I think in a more modern sense, we see that during the New Deal, right? I mean, we think of the birth of what I don't know if it's the birth, but some would argue the birth of big government, if you will, because we have by the 1930s we've become a much larger nation population-wise, And the issue confronting the government at that time was dire. 25% unemployment, people are literally going hungry. So you see an expansion of that power at the national level. I don't know if that's at the expense of the states, though. I don't know if a power is finite and and we only have so much power to distribute. I'm not sure if that expansion of power under the federal government to the federal government during, say, the New Deal was at the expense of states, or was it to help states?
Well, that's
Well,
becomes the
it was
question,
the
though.
anti-federalist. That was the anti-federalist. I got to get the anti-federalist in here, of course. That was the anti-federalist fear that the size does matter, and this nation this big, it would take a draconian national government to control it. So that was a part of their argument about the nature of the union was problematic. So
I want to add that, maybe India is not the best example because India is kind of maybe on a slide backwards. But India is a country of 1 billion people, and they're able to hold elections much more top down in the sense that we do in the United States. Um, so there's that. We are a big democracy. We are not the most populated democracy if you count India. I also just want to add that 2020 is considered by election experts as the most secure and fairest election that we've had in our history, and it was done in a way that we've done elections, at least since the 1940s, in the way of 10,000 different jurisdictions. Um, Volunteers do their thing. It may not, I agree, it's not the most efficient. And I wish there were some overriding principles that all states had to, like, certain rules of the game that all states had to mandate. Like you had to be, all states should have to be able to pull their mail-in ballots out of the envelopes before the polls open on election day, just so they can be ready to put into the scanners, right? Um, but for the most part, we've been able to hold free and fair elections, even though we do it in a way that on paper looks pretty chaotic and pretty decentralized.
I guess my frustration, Mike, is that, the 14th and 15th Amendments to me was a message that we need, to centralize. We need to shift this power to the national government. Yet we live in a time period in which both the, conservatives, I'll call them, I guess, I don't know if that's the right thing, but the majority of the court says, oh, no, we're perfectly fine with shifting this power, back to the states, in a way. And so I guess that's my frustration is here we are, a nation of 340 million, all right, with this history that we have to recognize of implicit racism within our election system. And we have worked to try to create protection at the national level. Yet now we have a very, I think, powerful movement, both legally and politically, to take it back to a time and place which, again, I just don't believe rights can be adequately protected. Do you understand my frustration?
No, I do. And I would say that you definitely are right, given the last 15 years of where we've seen things with voter ID laws and the Shelby decision. I think you're onto something. I'm saying with an act like the Voters' Rights Act, when it's in effect and implemented, you can have this balance of decentralized election and some federal um, oversight and still have the best of both worlds. But I agree, we are at a point where it seems like we're giving states maybe the same autonomy they had 150 years ago, and we know how that story goes.
I think one of and just to throw this out here, I don't know if I think it bears saying because it's decentralized, because as Mike alluded to, you got, precinct upon precinct upon precinct, and you walk down the street to your neighborhood church and you got the older folks there, checking your ID, and because it's so decentralized, it should make us feel better about the election because it's much harder to cheat in a decentralized election as opposed to, say, if everybody's ballots were sent in. I think here, David, where I agree with you, it'd be nicer if the federal government established, and I use this term again, a floor or a minimum of things that have to be like, okay, how about we just say everybody has a right to vote? right? The one we start with that. Everybody, if 18 and over, and every state then can say talk about perhaps felons or convicted felons, and that obviously they have that power. But let's start with that minimum idea that every person 18 and over, and if you register, except in my state of North Dakota, you register, you have the right to vote, a positive right to vote, because nowhere in the Constitution do we have that. And if we have the federal government establish these floors that are these guidelines, I think Mike alluded to this, that states have to follow. But then and it's been working for a long period of time, even though, I mean, some of the stuff baked into the cake has caused confusion. So I think that, and there was a great piece on 60 Minutes last night where they talked about that. It was fantastic. And it makes me think, hey, heck yeah, with it being so spread out, it is very decentralized, but it does make the idea of voter fraud way less likely.
So throughout the question, both implied and I think explicit, Mike, is this idea of the founding principles or the principles of the founders. Yet the question never really says what those principles are. So I'm curious if you can share your understanding. What are these principles that this question alludes to?
Sure. Let me tell you, I have a list of them right here.
Okay.
No, I'm guessing, here's my guess, and then all of you can chime in, obviously. Principles of liberty. I think a principle of the founder is one that is probably not as much in our society today as maybe civic virtue or the common good. Tim has mentioned this many times before, this Whig idea of limited government, this fear of government being too centralized or too big, which is what we were just talking about. Popular sovereignty, even though some of us don't like that term, but I think it's a principle that we like to espouse. Checks and balances, maybe as a principle. Those are my big five that I can pull from the 18th century. I don't know if a principle is I don't know if self-governance is folded into popular sovereignty, but I think something about self-governance as well. Maybe that's my sixth one.
And you would agree with me that equality is not a fundamental principle of the founders.
No, I purposely kept it out because I do not equality is the way we think about equality from the Civil War on. Yes, that was not a principle at the founding.
Okay. So of those big five that you just listed, well, I wonder, do those principles, in your opinion, still resonate in the 21st century? Or do they need to be adapted or eliminated or somewhere in between that? What's your thought? I mean, this is something we've talked about. And is it a living constitution? And if it is, do those principles constantly have to be revisited and
Yes,
discussed?
I mean they resonate because it's kind of like going to a family reunion and being like, oh yeah, that's what Uncle Tim is like, like it resonates. You remember, oh yeah, okay, it's out there, right? But that only gets you so far, right? I mean, I think it does have to be adaptable. So for example, the idea of liberty, which has all these different sub principles or sub things we could put onto it. Where does digital rights fit into that? Where does a sense of privacy and technology fit into that? Fit into my right to do what I want with my device, right? I don't think the founders can give us anything substantive to move on that. They can give us the principle of liberty, but how we shape liberty to to a concern like technology is something we have to do. Just another couple I'll throw out. You've already mentioned equality. Environmental stewardship, it seems to be, maybe is a principle that the founders were not much concerned about, but it's one that we have to think anew about. So I think there are the principles that we've inherited. I think we have to be constantly rethinking how they apply in our world. And I think that there are new principles, economic justice, environmental stewardship, I think are ones that equality are ones that are important today that maybe the founders didn't have in mind, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have them in mind for ourselves.
So, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time together on this. So, final thoughts and recommendations on, once again, an interesting question found in Unit 6 here. Mr. Kavanaugh, final thoughts, recommendations for students and teachers on this question.
Kids, avoid the gummies. Okay. Drugs are bad. Okay. To quote South Park. Yeah, this question is it is all over the place. It's a difficult question to deal with, and I'm really I'm glad I'm not having to write the 4-minute response and trying to anticipate follow-up questions to this. Challenge, and you heard David and David's questions to us, and especially his questions to Mike. Challenge that premise of what are these founding principles you keep referring to in this question? Slavery, the coverture of women. Think about those. What was life on the ground like in 1789, 1790? So, what are these founding principles you refer to? And we say this all the time. Do we mythologize them? And how has the struggle been in trying to expand what we like to think in terms of equality, which of course we don't get in the Constitution until 1867 in the 14th Amendment. Again, with a really difficult question that seems to be a lot of places, challenge the premise that we were all that in a bag of chips in 1787.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, this just popped into my head. I think if you're going to make the argument or make an identification of here are some founding principles, I would recommend that you have a founding document where you're quoting. Like, for example, an interesting project might be, okay, identify the founding principles in the Declaration. And by the way, the right to revolution might be one of those. Now think about that for a minute, kids. We haven't mentioned that as a founding principle, but it might, one reading of the Declaration would mean that is a founding principle. So then now you go to the preamble of the Constitution. There's your founding principles, right? So maybe do a little work on identifying a critically important document, identifying the principles that are driving that document, and do some comparison. I like the fact Mike mentioned environmental stewardship. Is that within life of the Declaration? I don't know, quality of life. So can you make an argument that they don't fit in the nice, those 3 silos in the Declaration, or 4 if we have revolution? So identify a document in the founding period, in the first founding period, and say here's my founding principles. And I think I think you would probably be well served in answering follow-up questions about founding principles if you root it within a particular document. And I think you'll notice some differences between Declaration and Constitution. In 14th Amendment, there's a different set of founding principles, I think.
Mike?
Yeah, I want to first off and say that Professor Roger Smith is at the University of Pennsylvania. One of his books was published by Princeton, so my bad. I'm going to build on what Tim said and say that I think, yes, after you find that principle rooted in a founding document, the question's also asking you to go find it in a Supreme Court case. And I would be looking within a Supreme Court case, do you see whatever founding principles you've identified, how they are in conflict with each other? And how might the court try to resolve that conflict, and what's the reasoning around that? Because that's the other thing. These founding principles do not exist in isolation. In the real world, they're going to become in tension with each other. And we're constantly, as citizens, having to make choices every day of how we deal with that tension.
Chris?
Can I throw out a court case coming up in December? Skrmetti. SKRMETTI. It's one of the first trans cases that the court is going to deal with. So we're talking about this new idea of rights and liberty. So that's on the docket for December for students. So maybe check that out and see what those questions are about that, because we're talking about these rights and what's the new rights categories that we may be getting into. So sorry.
No, I don't really have any recommendations other than to say I will pray for you, students and teachers, because I read this question, just the main question. It talks about slavery and really federalism, and then in the main question, it wants you to evaluate Supreme Court decisions of the legacy of I am so befuddled on how you're going to do that. So I wish you well, and I look forward to seeing some of the responses and how you deal with that. But then again, but once again, I will pray for you and hope that you don't go mad and that your teachers don't start chain smoking on the patio and trying to figure out how to help you on this. So in our next session, you might want to let the Unit 3 panel know that we will be dealing with one of our favorite subjects, and that is gerrymandering or gerrymandering, however you want to pronounce that, and voting rights. And so until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye bonds.